Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 17, Barbados. Welcome to Barbados. Fun fact, one of the main exports of the country is a kind of rum called Mount Gay rum, and is actually the oldest commercial rum distillery in the world. I actually went out and I got some, and I'm not gonna lie, it's really, really good. Probably like the best rum I've ever had. But let's move past my love for alcohol and talk about Barbados. Barbados is located in the Caribbean, specifically the Lesser Antilles chain. However, while most of the Lesser Antilles falls into an island arc going along the Caribbean plate, Barbados is just right outside of it, with it technically falling into the Atlantic Ocean. The neighboring countries around it are St. Lucia and St. Vincent and the Grenadines to the west, Trinidad and Tobago to the south, and if you go east for a really long time, I think, and the keyword is think, you would eventually hit Guinea-Bissau and West Africa. Climate-wise, the island country is fairly tropical, with a fairly warm, pleasant climate with beautiful beaches like the rest of the Caribbean. Also, the country, unlike most islands in the Caribbean, usually escapes the hurricanes that hit the Caribbean every year, so they're very lucky in that respect. Population-wise, the country has around 296,000 people in it. Most people in the country are black, with somewhere between 90 to 96% of the country being of African origin. The next largest racial group are white Barbadians, with around 4 to 7% being white, usually of English, Scottish, Irish, or Portuguese stock. Now next are what are known as Indian Barbadians, although Pakistanis and Bangladeshis are also thrown under this label as well. They make up around 1% of the population. Other racial and ethnic groups in the country include the Chinese, Arabs, and Romani. Also important to note, many people in the country, especially among the African community, are mixed, usually having at least some European and African ancestry. Language-wise, most people will speak English, and is the official language of the country. Now Barbados is like many other Caribbean states, with many people in the country speaking with their own distinctive accent and using their own local slang. Religion-wise, Christianity dominates the country, with over 90% of the country being Christian. Most Christians are Protestants, with the Anglican Church particularly dominating at around 30 to 40% of the country being Anglican. Other major Christian groups include Methodists, Pentecostals, Seventh-day Adventists, Baptists, Catholics, and Jehovah's Witnesses. Other religious groups include Muslims, Rastafarians, and Hindus. Along with this, there is a significant number of Barbadians who are irreligious, with around 2 to 9% holding no religion. Barbados was originally settled by Native Americans in pre-colonial times. Some of the major groups to enter the region were the Arawak Tribes in the 800s and the Carib Tribes in the 1200s, with the Caribs taking much of the Caribbean via brutal warfare and effective social organization. The islands would first be visited by the Portuguese in the 16th century, who named the islands Barbados after Os Barbudos, which means the bearded ones. This is similar to the origins of Barbuda that I talked about in episode 7 in the Antigua and Barbuda episode. And if you watched episode 7, I want to say thank you for suffering through my early episodes. Bearded is believed to refer to either the bearded Caribs on the island, the fig trees that have what are known as bearded roots, or the sea foam around the island that forms a kind of visual beard. While Portugal had claimed Barbados as their own, they didn't bother to settle it, and left it open to the Spanish. The Spanish didn't want to take control of the island, but they did want to use the island's population as a source of cheap labor. The Spanish would often raid the island, taking anyone they found as slaves to be worked to death in their other Caribbean colonies. Any Caribs who weren't captured by the Spanish either died due to disease or fled to other islands in the Caribbean. The first European settlement on the island would occur in 1627, with an English colony. Now the English were led by a friend of the king, Sir William Corton, who founded the colony as a proprietary colony, or essentially, a colony that was ruled by someone close to the English king. Corton would, however, lose the colony to another English noble known as James Hay, who had an overlapping claim on Barbados. While it's unlikely either man spent much time on the island, those that did often took to creating plantations on the island to farm a variety of crops such as tobacco, indigo, and ginger. Starting in 1640, the economy on the island would start to change. Several wealthy Dutchmen and Jews who had moved into the country began bringing with them a new profitable crop, sugarcane. Now sugarcane, while it is very profitable, isn't an easy crop to bring to market and requires a very labor-intensive workforce. At first, this workforce was made up of British people who had volunteered to go to Barbados as indentured servants. Those who went were promised after several years of service a small plot of land on the island. But many never saw this plot of land. Many would die due to the tough working conditions and the increasingly cruel masters, who often worked their servants to death. Eventually, word would get out that working on the plantations in Barbados would be a death sentence, so by the late 17th century, no Englishmen would go. The next group to come was the Irish. Now, there were some Irishmen who agreed to go to Barbados on their own volition, but many would go forcefully. Ireland was under control of England, and most Irish people, and especially Irish Catholics, hated the English at that time. Rebellions, along with banditry, was also fairly common in Ireland. Often those that rebelled and got caught could expect to be sent to Barbados and other English colonies to work on the plantations as a punishment. Poor Irish Catholics would sometimes also be sent over, just because. I mean, what are they going to do? Rebel against sent over anyways? Irish transportation to the Caribbean would peak in the 1650s before eventually slowing down in the 1660s before ending in 1685. Now, interestingly enough, there was at one point where Barbados achieved de facto independence. During the English Civil War, a conflict between those that liked the king and liked that the Church of England was very Catholic-y, and those that didn't like the king and didn't like that the Church of England was very Catholic-y, many leaders in Barbados chose to side with the king, or the royalist cause. This would cause some problems, as in 1648 the King of England would be executed. This left Barbados, one of England's most populous colonies at the time, on its own. The English government actually banned trade between England and Barbados, and from 1615 to 1651, Barbados would be run by a local council made up of the rich and wealthy landowners on the island. In 1651, Barbados would be invaded by the government back in England and be brought back into line. The end of the English Civil War also saw a demographic change on the island. African slaves became increasingly more common on the plantations as a cheap labor source. African slaves didn't have to be promised a piece of land after several years of use, and were cheaper than transporting Irishmen. The population on the island would by the end of the 17th century be majority African, and while conditions on the sugar plantations had never been good, with African slaves who were considered racially inferior to the Europeans, the plantations became even worse, as torture and sexual assault became commonplace in the sugar plantations throughout the island. The rise in slave labor also saw many, although not all, of the poor whites leave the island, and an increasing amount of wealth being concentrated in the rich white plantation owners. Now, slave rebellions would pop up from time to time, even as far back as when the Irish were working on the plantations. However, the largest would occur in 1816. A slave known as Busa found himself working in what became known as a house slave, or essentially, a slave that worked in the slave master's home. This gave Busa a certain degree of authority, and slowly, he began to plan with other slaves and freed blacks on the island a slave revolt. They planned to overthrow the local government and give another slave, Washington Franklin, the role of governor on the island. Busa led a force of over 400 slaves in raiding several plantations on the island on Easter 1816. Busa would be killed and his rebellion would be put down, however, later in the day by the island's colonial militia. While Busa's rebellion had failed, it did signify to many that slavery couldn't continue on in the British Empire. Other slave revolts in several other colonies and a growing desire from the British public forced the UK to abolish slavery in 1833. But while slavery was over, whites still dominated the island. Most blacks only had the skills to work on the plantations, and very few managed to find better paying jobs on the island. By the end of the 19th century, many blacks still worked in the same place their forefathers had worked, and many fell into poverty. These tough working conditions led to many on the island to work overseas, and to try to earn a living there so they could send money back home to their family. Many would travel to both Cuba and Panama. Of those that went to Panama, many actually helped build the Panama Canal. You would also see a large population of Barbadians moving to Anglophone countries like the UK, Canada, and America. And these countries today still have some of the largest Barbadian populations outside of Barbados itself. The immigration out of Barbados would ultimately help improve the income for a decent chunk of the island's black population. Income inequality would still persist, however, and came to the forefront during the Great Depression in the 30s. Black activists would form several trade unions and took to protesting the labor conditions in the country and the lack of input they had in political affairs. 1937 in particular would see riots in the streets as black laborers protested the lack of support for their community. All of this would see the formation of the Barbados Labour Party, or the BLP. The BLP sought to appeal to poor blacks on the island, and represented broadly social democratic, social liberal, and center-left views. They fought for increased social security, universal suffrage, better education, and greater self-autonomy on the island. The BLP was at first led by Grantley Herbert Adams. Adams would lead the party to victory in the first election with universal suffrage in 1951. He would become the first premier of the colony, and sought to improve conditions on the island, although slowly, a growing number of more left-wing elements began to oppose him, seeing him as too conservative and liberal. Adams would rule until 1958, when instead, Adams became the head of the West Indies Federation. The West Indies Federation was a federation, I know, big shocker, of Caribbean islands that were all currently under British rule. The federation was modeled after states like Canada and Australia, hoping to be the Caribbean version of those states. However, the West Indies Federation suffered from infighting, as Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, the two largest and wealthiest states in the federation, both fought each other over who would dominate, and began to feel that the Federation benefited the smaller members and not them. By 1962, the Federation was dissolved. Back in Barbados, the BLP ran into trouble. A group of left-wing members of the party, led by Earl Barrow, broke off, forming the Democratic Labour Party, or DLP. They ideologically are actually fairly close to the BLP, although they lean slightly further left. The DLP would win the 1961 election, with Barrow becoming the premier of the colony. He would further increase social security spending and sought to give full independence to Barbados. In 1966, this would be achieved, with Barbados gaining full independence and Barrow becoming the prime minister, although with the Queen still as head of state in a ceremonial position. Barrow would also slowly start the process of moving the Barbadian economy away from just agriculture, and sought to diversify the economy. First, Barbados would focus on manufacturing, with stuff like Mount Gay rum, but also electronics and a limited amount of crude oil being exported overseas. However, the big industry would be tourism. Barbados being a beautiful island in the Caribbean made tourism ideal, and slowly, more and more Americans and Brits would come to see the country's beautiful beaches. International businesses also began to come into the country, as Barbados would, and still today, has fairly cheap taxes on corporations. In terms of political drama in the country, the BLP and the DLP would go back and forth several times on who controlled the country. The BLP under Tom Adams would rule from 1976 to 1985, with Adams sending troops to aid the US invasion of Grenada in the 80s before dying of a heart attack. Barrow, leading the DLP, would come back into power in 1986, before he too would die in 1987. The BLP would again take power in the country under Owen Arthur, from 1994 to 2008. Arthur would work to increase relations with other Caribbean states and America, hoping to boost the economy that way. The DLP would take control in 2008 under David Thompson, before he died of cancer in 2010, and then Frendel Stewart took charge. The DLP government at this time would struggle with economic downturn due to the financial slowdown of 2008 and an increase in foreign debt. In 2018, the BLP would beat the DLP in an election, winning a record 70% of the vote and 30 out of 30 seats in the country's legislature. They were led by Mia Mottley, who would become the first female prime minister of the country. Mottley would attempt to reduce foreign debt and poverty in the country, and work to see the country through COVID, which has dramatically reduced tourism, greatly hurting the economy. Now, the country is currently in the Commonwealth realm, with the Queen still technically being the head of the country, and the Governor-General being Sandra Mason. However, in September of 2020, Mason announced the country would by November of 2021 remove the Queen as head of state and become a republic. Previous governments had promised a move towards Barbados becoming a republic, often arguing that this would remove the remaining colonial ties of the country and give the country full sovereignty. While the Queen really doesn't affect Barbadian politics, and the new republic would likely have almost the same political institutions as the previous system, it is mostly just the symbolic nature of the act that is important. Today, a decent chunk, if not a majority of Barbadians, actually are in favor of some form of reparations for slavery, arguing that modern-day colonial states that benefited from slavery still continue to dominate the states that suffered under slavery. So why does Barbados exist? The fact that Barbados is just one island has paradoxically meant that the country is reliant on the outside world, while also being fairly ingenious and self-reliant. The country requires close cooperation from the outside world for its economy and way of life. But the fact that they also have one of the largest populations in the Caribbean has helped them pull their resources together, and with cooperation and smart thinking from within, it has helped Barbados become one of the richest states in the Caribbean. Up next, we go east to Belarus. Prepare for, not the British this time, but the Russians instead, authoritarianism, and a government in exile that refuses to come home. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. I'm sure if you've listened to the Bahamas or Antigua and Barbuda episode, you'll notice a lot of similarities between them. A lot of the British Caribbean states, they kind of have the same outline to their history, which I think is interesting. It makes it pretty easy to research just because I know kind of the trajectory of it coming in. I think I'll have a side episode before I work on Belarus. I'm debating between doing either the British overseas territories and then just talking about like the history of them, doing a short history of the ones in the Caribbean, and then later on I could do the ones outside of the Caribbean. I know I talked about doing the Libertarian Microstate one, so maybe I'll do that. I don't know. It'll just depend. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed. My email is whydocountriesexist@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. The sources I use for this video are the BBC's news article, Barbados elects Mia Mottley as first woman PM, Central Bank of Barbados' documentary, The Story of Barbados' Economic and Social Transformation, Channel 4 News Report, Barbados drops the Queen and says it's becoming a republic, Danes Blackman's video, Earl Barrow, the father of Barbadian independence, General Knowledge's video, The Caribbean Country Nobody Knows About, Geography Now's video, Barbados, History of Ireland's article, Cromwell and the Irish Migration to the Caribbean, It's Caribbean's article on Busa, Juan Enrique Balcardo Burton's video, Barbados Lost Roots, Mr. History's video, A Super Quick History of Barbados, US Today's article, Barbados announces plan to remove Queen as head of state next year, Whitehall Mall's documentary's video, Barbados the First Slave Society and the Sugar Plantations of British Barbados, and Wikipedia.